The morning of June 14, 2018, started like any other summer day in the small riverside town of Millbrook. Sarah Henderson kissed her two sons goodbye as they headed out for what should have been a simple afternoon of fishing at their favorite spot along the Clearwater River. Ethan was 12, responsible and careful. His younger brother Lucas, barely 9, looked up to him like a hero. Neither parent could have imagined that within hours, their entire world would shatter into a nightmare that would last 5 long years. When the boys didn't return by sunset, their father Michael drove to the fishing spot. He found their tackle box sitting neatly on the riverbank, Lucas's favorite blue cap floating in the shallow water near the shore. The fishing rods were gone. There was no sign of struggle, no obvious clues, just an eerie absence that sent ice through Michael's veins. He called the police immediately, his hands shaking so badly he could barely hold the phone. The search began within hours. Volunteers from across 3 counties showed up, forming lines through the dense woods that bordered the Clearwater River. Divers combed the murky waters. Helicopters with thermal imaging swept overhead. For 2 weeks, the community searched relentlessly, finding nothing. No clothing, no bodies, no trace of Ethan and Lucas Henderson. It was as if the earth had simply swallowed them whole. Sarah couldn't eat. She couldn't sleep. She spent nights staring at their empty beds, unable to even cry anymore. Michael threw himself into organizing search efforts, refusing to believe his sons were gone. But as weeks turned to months, then years, the searches became less frequent. The media attention faded. People stopped asking. The town slowly, painfully moved on. Everyone except the Hendersons. The wait of 5 years. 5 years is a lifetime when you don't know if your children are alive or dead. Sarah developed severe anxiety and depression, requiring medication just to function through basic daily tasks. Michael's construction business nearly collapsed, as he spent every spare moment following up on phantom leads and supposed sightings that always led nowhere. Their marriage strained under the weight of grief and guilt, each blaming themselves in silent, separate suffering. The boys' bedroom remained untouched, frozen in time. Ethan's baseball trophies gathered dust on the shelf. Lucas's dinosaur posters still decorated the walls. Sarah would sometimes sit in there for hours, holding their clothes, trying to remember the exact sound of their laughter. The pain never dulled. It just became a permanent fixture, a shadow they learned to carry. Detective James Morrison, who had led the initial investigation, never officially closed the case. Even after he retired 3 years in, he kept copies of all the files at home. Something about the Henderson case haunted him. The complete lack of evidence didn't sit right. No ransom demand, no bodies, no credible witness reports. It was as if the boys had simply vanished into thin air. Morrison couldn't shake the feeling that he'd missed something crucial. The river community changed after the disappearance. Parents became more protective, more fearful. The carefree days of kids wandering down to fish unsupervised ended. The Clearwater River, once a source of joy and recreation, became a place of dark speculation and whispered theories. Some believed the boys had drowned and their bodies were swept downstream. Others thought they'd been abducted. A few even suggested they'd run away, though that theory made no sense for children so young and happy. March 17, 2023, the discovery. Tom Brennan was 63 years old, a retired postal worker who spent most days fishing along the less-traveled stretches of the Clearwater River. His chocolate Labrador, Duke, always came along, more interested in chasing riverbirds than actually helping catch anything. On that cool March morning, Tom decided to explore a section of river he rarely visited, a rocky area about 8 miles downstream from where the Henderson boys had last been seen. The terrain was rough, with limestone cliffs rising sharply from the water's edge. Duke bounded ahead as always, nose to the ground, investigating every scent. But about an hour into their walk, the dog's behavior changed dramatically. Duke stopped near what looked like a narrow crevice in the cliff face, partially obscured by overgrown vegetation. The dog started whining, a sound Tom had never heard him make before. "What is it, boy?" Tom called, trying to coax Duke away, but the Labrador refused to move. He pawed at the ground near the crevice, whining louder, then barking insistently. Tom's first thought was that Duke had cornered some animal, maybe a raccoon or possum hiding in the rocks. He approached carefully, pulling aside the thick vines that covered what appeared to be the entrance to a cave. The opening was small, maybe 3 feet wide and 4 feet tall. Tom pulled out his flashlight and shined it inside. The beam revealed that the cave opened into a larger chamber beyond the narrow entrance. Duke pushed past him, squeezing through the gap and disappearing into the darkness. Tom hesitated. He wasn't a young man anymore, and crawling into unexplored caves wasn't exactly smart. But Duke's continued barking echoed from inside, insistent and urgent. "Damn it, Duke," Tom muttered, getting down on his knees. He squeezed through the opening, his flashlight beam sweeping across the cave interior. The space opened up significantly once past the entrance, forming a chamber roughly 15 feet across. The floor was sandy, littered with rocks and debris washed in during floods. Duke stood in the center, still barking at something in the far corner. Tom's flashlight beam found what had captured Duke's attention. His heart stopped. There, against the back wall of the cave, were 2 backpacks, small, clearly designed for children. Next to them lay a rusted fishing rod and what looked like an old sleeping bag. Tom's hands started shaking as he moved closer, his mind refusing to process what he might be about to find. The sleeping bag was empty, but nearby Tom found scraps of food wrappers, a broken flashlight, and something that made his blood run cold. A child's shoe, worn and weathered but still recognizable. On the cave wall, scratched into the limestone with what must have been a sharp rock, were words that made Tom's legs go weak. Ethan plus Lucas help. Tom backed out of the cave as fast as his trembling body would allow, Duke following reluctantly. With shaking hands, he pulled out his cell phone. No signal. He started running back toward his truck, Duke racing alongside him. It took 20 minutes to reach an area with reception. He dialed 911, barely able to speak through his gasping breaths. "I found something," he managed to tell the dispatcher. "The Henderson boys. I think I found where they were. You need to send everyone, now." The investigation within 2 hours. The cave was swarming with law enforcement. Detective Morrison, though retired, arrived at the scene when he heard the news. The evidence team carefully documented everything, photographing the scratched message on the wall, collecting the backpacks and personal items. The backpacks contained soggy, moldering notebooks with childish handwriting, Ethan's diary entries, that would later reveal a heartbreaking story of survival and desperation. The forensic team determined that the boys had indeed been in the cave, likely sheltering there after their disappearance, but they clearly weren't there anymore and hadn't been for some time. The question that haunted everyone was simple but agonizing. Where were they now? Were they still alive? Search teams expanded their efforts, this time focusing on the area surrounding the cave. Cadaver dogs were brought in. Divers searched the river with renewed intensity. The community mobilized again. 5 years of dormant hope suddenly reignited into desperate action. Sarah Henderson collapsed when she heard the news, unable to process the terrible mixture of hope and terror. Michael drove immediately to the cave site, demanding to be let inside. Detective Morrison studied the diary entries late into the night. Ethan's handwriting, shaky and scared, described what had happened that terrible day in June. The boys had been fishing when they'd seen someone on the riverbank, a man who'd approached them claiming to need help finding his lost dog. The entries grew more fragmented and difficult to read, but Morrison pieced together a horrifying picture of deception, of being led away from the fishing spot, of running when they realized something was terribly wrong. According to the diary, the boys had fled into the woods, eventually finding the cave as a hiding place. They'd stayed there, terrified to come out, surviving on fish they caught from the river at night and berries they found nearby. But the most devastating entry was dated nearly 3 weeks after their disappearance. "Lucas is sick, really sick. I don't know what to do. He won't wake up right. I have to go find help. If anyone finds this, we went north along the river. I'm scared, but I have to save Lucas. Ethan." That entry was the last one in the diary. Morrison stared at it for a long time, his decades of experience as a detective telling him what the evidence suggested, but his heart refusing to accept it. The boys had been alive for weeks, so close to town, and no one had found them. Then Ethan had tried to save his brother, leaving the relative safety of the cave to venture into unknown territory. The expanded search. The search focused north along the river, teams working in a coordinated grid pattern. Morrison pulled old missing persons reports from the 5 years since the Henderson boys disappeared, cross-referencing any unidentified remains or reports of children matching their description. Nothing matched. It was as if they'd vanished all over again. On the 4th day of the new search, a hiker found something 2 miles north of the cave, a small clearing where someone had clearly camped. There were remnants of a fire pit, more food wrappers, and carved into a tree trunk. E+L 7718. July 7th, 2018, nearly a month after they'd disappeared. They'd made it this far, they'd survived that long. Sarah Henderson clung to these discoveries like lifelines. They were survivors, she kept repeating to anyone who would listen. They're smart. They could still be out there. But with each passing day of the new search, hope became harder to maintain. Michael's face grew more haggard, the weight of renewed uncertainty crushing whatever fragile peace he'd managed to build over the years. Then, on day 7, a call came in from a ranger station 30 miles downstream. A ranger had been going through old logbooks and found an entry from late July 2018 that had been overlooked. A report of 2 disheveled boys seen near a campground, very thin and apparently disoriented. The ranger who'd made the report had called it in, but somehow the call had been logged incorrectly and never connected to the Henderson case. The boys had been spotted getting into a vehicle with an older woman. Morrison felt his pulse quicken. This was it, the lead they'd been missing for 5 years. The ranger's description included details about the vehicle, a faded blue pickup truck with camping equipment in the bed. Working with the FBI, Morrison began pulling traffic camera footage and registration records from that time frame, searching for any vehicle matching that description in the area. The breakthrough. It took 3 more days of exhaustive investigation, but they found her. Margaret Connolly, 68 years old, living in a remote cabin 45 miles from Millbrook. She had no criminal record, no history that would raise red flags. She was a widow who lived alone, gardening and keeping to herself. When officers approached her property, they noticed something that made their hearts race. 2 bicycles leaning against the porch, clearly sized for teenagers. The tactical team moved in carefully, unsure what they'd find. When they knocked on the door, Margaret answered calmly, seeming almost relieved. Behind her, in the modest living room, 2 teenage boys sat at a table doing homework. They looked up as the officers entered, confusion on their faces that quickly turned to shock as they registered the uniforms and weapons. "Ethan," one officer said carefully. "Lucas Henderson?" The older boy, now 17, though still small for his age, stared at the officers. Recognition flickered in his eyes, memories of a life he'd almost forgotten. The younger boy, 14 now, looked frightened and confused. "I don't understand," Ethan said quietly. "What's happening?" Margaret Connolly didn't resist or run. She sat down heavily in a chair, her hands shaking. "I found them by the river," she said softly. "The little one was so sick. They were terrified, half-starved. I took them to the hospital." "No, you didn't," Morrison said, his voice hard. He'd already checked every hospital within 100 miles. No records of treating the Henderson boys. Margaret's face crumpled. "I was going to. I swear I was. But they begged me not to. They said someone had tried to hurt them, that they couldn't go home, and I thought maybe I could help them. Maybe they could stay with me. I'd lost my grandson the year before, you see, and the house was so empty." Her voice trailed off as she realized how hollow the excuse sounded. What had started as a lonely woman convincing herself she was helping had turned into kidnapping, even if the original intent had been different. The boys had been so young, so traumatized, that they'd believed her when she told them it wasn't safe to go home. Over time, their memories of their previous life had faded, replaced by the new normal she'd created. The reunion. Sarah and Michael Henderson received the call they'd dreamed of for 5 years. "We found them. They're alive." The words seemed impossible, too good to be true. When they arrived at the police station where the boys were being held for medical evaluation, Sarah couldn't breathe. Her sons, her babies, were in the building, alive. But the reunion was more complicated than the simple joy she'd imagined in her fantasies. Ethan recognized them immediately, tears streaming down his face as 5 years of buried memories came flooding back. He remembered everything. The fishing trip, The man who'd approached them running through the woods, Lucas getting sick, the desperate decision to trust Margaret when she'd found them by the river. Lucas was different. He'd been so young when they'd disappeared that his memories of his parents were hazy at best. He knew Ethan was his brother. That bond had remained strong throughout their ordeal. But Sarah and Michael were strangers to him. Faces from photographs Margaret had eventually admitted were his real parents, but who felt disconnected from his lived experience. When Sarah tried to hug him, he flinched, overwhelmed and confused. The trauma specialists explained that recovery would be a long process. Ethan would need extensive therapy to process not just the original abduction attempt, but the years of isolation and the guilt he carried for Lucas's memory loss. Lucas would need to rebuild connections with parents he couldn't really remember, all while processing the truth about the woman he'd come to see as his grandmother. Margaret Connolly was arrested and charged with kidnapping and child endangerment. The legal case was complicated by the unusual circumstances. She hadn't violently abducted the boys, but she had kept them from their families for 5 years. Prosecutors would have to weigh her actions against the fact that she had, in her own misguided way, likely saved Lucas's life when she'd found them and nursed him back to health. The questions that remained. The original man who'd approached the boys at the river was never found. Ethan's descriptions led to composite sketches and an investigation, but the trail was 5 years cold. Whoever he was, whatever his intentions had been, he'd vanished as completely as the boys once had. That knowledge haunted Morrison and the other investigators, a predator who'd gotten away, potentially still out there. Tom Brennan and Duke became local heroes, though Tom insisted he'd done nothing special. Duke deserved all the credit. The Labrador had sensed something in that cave that Tom would have walked right past. The Henderson family visited Tom several times, grateful beyond words for his persistence in investigating Duke's strange behavior that day. The cave where the boys had hidden became a strange landmark. Some wanted to seal it up, erase the painful reminder. Others felt it should be preserved as a testament to survival and hope. Eventually, the community decided to place a small memorial plaque nearby, acknowledging what had happened while respecting the family's privacy. Healing and moving forward. 6 months after the reunion, the Henderson family appeared at a press conference. Sarah spoke about the journey ahead, the therapy sessions, the small victories and continued struggles. Ethan, sitting beside her, had grown 3 inches and gained 15 pounds. He was enrolled in online school, working toward catching up with his peers. He still had nightmares, still struggled with guilt and anger, but he was home. Lucas, she explained, was making progress in his own way. He'd started calling them Mom and Dad, though the words still felt new in his mouth. He was fascinated by the brother they described, the 9-year-old Lucas who'd loved dinosaurs and hated broccoli. He was getting to know that version of himself through old photos and videos, building bridges between who he'd been and who he'd become. "We lost 5 years," Sarah said, her voice steady despite the tears. "Nothing can give us that time back, but we have tomorrow. We have the rest of their childhoods, their teenage years, their graduations, their futures. We have hope. And sometimes hope is everything." Michael spoke about forgiveness, how complicated it was. He was grateful to Margaret for saving Lucas's life, for caring for his sons when they were lost and afraid. But he was also angry at her for stealing 5 years, for not making the right choice to return them. Both feelings existed simultaneously, he explained, and he was learning to accept that contradiction. The community rallied around the family, giving them space when needed, but offering support in countless quiet ways. Meals appeared on their porch. An anonymous donor paid for the boys' therapy for a full year. The local school system created individualized education plans to help both boys catch up academically without the pressure of immediate full-time attendance. Detective Morrison visited the Henderson home one evening, 6 months after the discovery. He brought the diary, Ethan's diary from the cave, now released from evidence. He thought Ethan might want it someday, as a record of his own survival and courage. Ethan held the small, water-damaged notebook carefully, looking at his own childish handwriting from 5 years earlier. "I was so scared," Ethan said quietly. "Every single day I was terrified, scared we'd die in that cave, scared whoever had tried to take us would find us. Scared Lucas wouldn't get better. He paused, turning pages filled with his younger self's desperate words. But I kept writing, because I thought maybe someday someone would find it and know what happened to us. Morrison nodded. You did everything right, Ethan. You saved your brother. You survived. That took more courage than most adults ever have to show in their entire lives. Legacy. The Henderson case changed how missing children investigations were conducted in the region. New protocols were implemented for cross-referencing reports and following up on unusual sightings. The ranger whose original report had been mishandled felt tremendous guilt, but the family publicly forgave him, acknowledging that the system had failed, not any individual. Tom Brennan established a foundation in Duke's name to train search and rescue dogs specifically for locating missing persons. Duke himself became something of a celebrity, appearing at fundraising events and school safety assemblies. The old Labrador seemed to understand his special status, accepting treats and attention with dignified appreciation. For Sarah and Michael, life became about cherishing the present while gently acknowledging the past. They celebrated the boys' birthdays with double cakes, one for the age they were, one for the age they should have been if those years hadn't been stolen. It was their way of honoring both the time lost and the time regained. Ethan began speaking at events about child safety and awareness, turning his trauma into purpose. He talked about the importance of trusting your instincts, about the fact that survival sometimes means making difficult choices, about never giving up hope, even when circumstances seem impossible. Lucas, younger and still processing his fractured memories, found healing through art. He drew pictures of the cave, the river, the cabin where they'd lived. His therapist said it was his way of integrating his experiences, making sense of two different childhoods that existed in one life. The man who got away, the investigation into the man who'd originally approached the boys continued, though leads remained frustratingly sparse. Morrison worked the case unofficially in his retirement, unable to let it go. Ethan's description was detailed. Middle-aged, average height, brown hair, a distinctive scar on his left forearm. But thousands of men matched that description. Then, 2 years after the boys were found, a break came from an unexpected source. A woman in a neighboring state saw the still-active wanted poster and composite sketch. She contacted police, claiming it looked like her ex-husband, a man with a history of concerning behavior around children who'd been living near Millbrook in 2018 before abruptly moving away. The investigation intensified. When police located and questioned the man, his alibi for the day the Henderson boys disappeared was weak and contradictory. A search warrant of his property revealed items that linked him to other disappearances, other families' nightmares. He would eventually be charged with multiple counts related to different cases, though the Henderson case remained difficult to prosecute due to the boys' young ages and traumatic memories. But for Sarah and Michael, knowing he'd been caught meant their sons were finally truly safe. The monster who'd stolen their childhood was behind bars, unable to harm anyone else. It didn't erase what had happened, but it closed a door that had remained terrifyingly open. 5 years later, by 2028, Ethan was 22 and attending community college, studying criminal justice. He wanted to work with missing children cases, to be the person who never gave up looking the way Morrison had never given up on him. Lucas was 19, working at an animal shelter while figuring out his path. He'd developed a special bond with dogs, crediting Duke with saving his life. The family gathered annually on June 14th, not to mourn the anniversary of the disappearance, but to celebrate what Sarah called their second beginning. They'd return to the river, to the fishing spot where it all started, and spend the day together. It was their way of reclaiming that place, of refusing to let fear and trauma define it forever. Duke passed away peacefully in his sleep in 2027, at the age of 14. The Henderson family attended his memorial service, which drew hundreds of people. They commissioned a statue of the loyal Labrador to be placed in the town park, a permanent reminder that sometimes heroes have 4 legs and fur coats. Margaret Connolly served 4 years in prison and was released on parole in 2027. The boys requested a meeting with her, supervised and carefully managed by their therapists. It was complicated and emotional, a mixture of gratitude for keeping them alive and anger for keeping them captive. Forgiveness, they were learning, wasn't simple or absolute. It was a process, ongoing and imperfect. The cave remained, a dark chapter in their history that couldn't be erased. But nearby, the community planted a grove of trees, 2 oak saplings that would grow tall and strong, representing Ethan and Lucas. Over time, as the trees matured, they would transform that stretch of river from a place of pain into a symbol of resilience and survival. Sarah Henderson, reflecting on the journey a decade after that terrible June day, said it best, "We lost 5 years, but we didn't lose our sons. We didn't lose hope. And in the end, that made all the difference. Life doesn't always give you happy endings, but sometimes, if you're incredibly lucky and you never stop believing, it gives you second chances." The story of the Henderson boys became a reminder to their community and beyond, that miracles sometimes come in unexpected forms, that persistence matters, and that even in our darkest moments, there are those who refuse to give up. Whether it's a detective holding onto files from a retired case, a fisherman following his dog's instincts, or 2 boys surviving against impossible odds, hope has a way of persisting even when every rational thought says it shouldn't. And sometimes that hope is rewarded with the most precious gift of all, the chance to go home.